My name is Patricia Donovan. I'm 51 years old. And the day I discovered my daughter-in-law was stealing from me, she handed me the evidence herself. I know how that sounds, like something from a movie, right? But I'm telling you, sometimes real life is stranger than any script. That Tuesday morning, when Sophia rushed into my house, holding my son's lunchbox, apologizing for running late to her nursing shift, I had no idea I was holding proof of a betrayal so deep it would nearly destroy my family. For 5 years, I'd welcomed this woman into my life. After my husband Gerald died, she was the one who held my hand at the funeral. She called me every Sunday. She remembered my birthday. She felt like the daughter I never had. And Marcus, my only son, my pride and joy, he loved her so completely, it made my heart full just watching them together. That morning started like any other. I was planning to drop off Marcus's forgotten lunch at his office, maybe grab coffee after, head to my book club. Simple, normal, the kind of peaceful routine I'd earned after 28 years as a tax accountant and a comfortable early retirement. But when I opened that lunchbox in my car, waiting in a hot parking lot for Marcus to finish a meeting, there was no sandwich inside. No fruit, no thermos of coffee, just documents. Stacks of them. And every single page was a piece of a puzzle I never knew existed. A puzzle that, once assembled, revealed a picture so ugly, so calculated, so cruel, that it made me question everything I thought I knew about trust, about family, about the people we let into our homes and our hearts. What I found in that lunchbox would lead to criminal charges, a destroyed marriage, and a courtroom confrontation that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. This is a long story, and honestly, I still can't believe I'm the one telling it. If you want to hear how a single mistake brought down an entire house of lies is cheeky with me, you can follow along with the stories shared here. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Because what I discovered was just the beginning. Let me take you back to how that morning actually unfolded, because the devil really is in the details. I woke up around 7, like I always do, made myself some coffee, watered my plants on the porch, watched the neighborhood come alive. Retirement had given me this gift of slow mornings, and I treasured them. Gerald and I had worked so hard for this life, the paid-off house in a quiet Portland suburb, the financial security, the peace. Around 8:30, I heard the doorbell. When I opened it, there was Sophia in her blue scrubs, hair pulled back in that neat ponytail she always wore for work, looking flustered in a way I'd never really seen before. She explained that Marcus had rushed out without his lunch, and she was already late for her shift at the hospital. Could I possibly drop it off at his office? He'd be so grateful. She knew it was an inconvenience, but she was already running behind schedule. Of course, I said yes. Marcus worked at a software company just 10 minutes from my house. I'd done this favor a dozen times before. Sophia thanked me, flashed that warm smile of hers, and practically jogged back to her car. I remember thinking she seemed more stressed than usual, but nurses work brutal hours. I didn't think much of it. I grabbed my purse, picked up the black thermal lunchbox from where Sophia had set it on my kitchen counter, and drove over to Marcus's office building. The receptionist recognized me immediately. I'd been there enough times, but when I asked for Marcus, she told me he was in an important client meeting that had just started. It would probably run at least 2 hours. 2 hours. In a hot car, with perishable food. I settled into my sedan in the parking lot, scrolling through my phone, checking emails, playing a word game. The morning sun was beating down, and after about 40 minutes, I started worrying about the food spoiling. I had a small cooler bag in my trunk from a grocery run the week before. I figured I'd transfer the lunchbox into it, keep everything fresh. That's when I popped open the lunchbox, and my heart just stopped. No containers of pasta, no sandwich wrapped in foil, no apple or granola bar or any of the healthy meals Sophia always packed for Marcus. Just papers, folded documents stuffed into every compartment where food should have been. My first thought, I swear, was that this had to be work documents. Maybe Marcus had asked Sophia to pack some reports he needed to review. Maybe I'd grabbed the wrong bag entirely. But something about the way they were hidden, tucked and folded so carefully, made my stomach turn. I pulled out the first document with shaking hands. It was a birth certificate. State of Oregon. A little girl named Lily Chun. Born 2 years and 3 months ago right here in Portland. Mother's name, Sophia Donovan. Father's name, blank. Just a line where a name should be. I stared at that paper for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sophia Donovan. A 2-year-old child I'd never heard of. A blank space where my son's name should have been. The next item was worse. Printed photographs, the kind you'd print at home on regular paper. Sophia with a man I'd never seen. Asian, handsome, probably in his 30s. They weren't just standing together, they were holding each other, kissing, and in several photos, they were holding a baby. A toddler, the same little girl, I realized. Lily. The dates were stamped in the corners, some from 3 years ago, some from 6 months ago, one from just 2 weeks earlier. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept pulling out more papers, each one more devastating than the last. Bank statements from an account I didn't recognize, showing deposits of $3,000 every single month for the past 8 months. $24,000 total, and when I looked closer at where those deposits came from, I saw an account number that made my blood run cold. It was mine, my savings account. The one Gerald had left me, the one that was supposed to keep me secure for the rest of my life. Someone had been transferring my money, $3,000 a month, to Sophia's secret account for 8 months. Then I found the checks. Copies of checks written from my checking account, made out to cash, signed with my signature, except I never wrote those checks. I would have remembered. The signature looked like mine, but when I studied it closely, I could see tiny differences. The way the P curved a loop in the D, someone had practiced. Someone had gotten good at forging my name. The lunchbox felt heavier with every document I pulled out. There were credit card statements for cards I'd never opened. Small charges, nothing that would trigger fraud alerts, $50 here, $75 there, all adding up over months. And then, at the very bottom, I found the document that made everything click into place. A legal petition, drafted by a family law attorney named Mitchell Pearson. It outlined a custody arrangement for a minor child named Lily Chun following the dissolution of marriage between Sophia Donovan and Marcus Donovan. But that wasn't the part that made me feel like I was going to be sick. There was a section about child support and spousal maintenance. $8,000 per month. The justification cited the lifestyle Sophia had become accustomed to during the marriage and the substantial family resources available. There was a specific mention of significant inherited assets held by the paternal grandmother. Me? They were talking about me, about Gerald's life insurance, about the money we'd saved through decades of careful planning. Clipped to the petition were printed emails, Sophia to someone named David. Recent emails from just last week. She wrote about how she needed to keep Marcus in the dark just a little longer. How she was so close to securing everything. How once the money from his mother was safely protected in the right accounts, she could finally stop pretending and live her real life with David and Lily. I sat in that hot car, documents spread across my lap, and realized I was looking at a map of betrayal so complete, so calculated that it had its own timeline, its own strategy, its own endgame. And the endgame was destroying my family and stealing my future. The worst part? Sophia had handed it all to me herself. I need you to understand something about me. I spent 28 years as a tax accountant. I dealt with numbers, patterns, discrepancies. I knew how to spot when something didn't add up. But sitting in that parking lot, holding evidence of a betrayal I never saw coming, I realized I'd been blind in my own life. My first instinct was to storm into Marcus's meeting, to call Sophia and scream at her, to drive to the police station immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe it was my years of dealing with financial fraud cases, maybe it was pure survival instinct. But I knew that if I reacted emotionally right now, if I showed my hand too soon, Sophia would have time to cover her tracks, to destroy evidence, to spin some story that would make me look like a paranoid old woman. So instead, I took a breath, and I started documenting everything. I photographed every single document in that lunchbox. Every bank statement, Every forged check, every printed email, every photo of Sophia with this David person and their child. I made sure the dates were visible, the account numbers were clear, the legal letterhead was readable. My hands were still shaking, but I forced them steady enough to capture every detail. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it, folded the same way, stacked in the same order. If Sophia realized I'd seen this, the entire case could fall apart. I needed her to think she was still safe, still hidden, still winning. I couldn't wait 2 hours for Marcus's meeting to end. I walked back into that office building and told the receptionist it was a family emergency. Medical? Urgent. The kind of words that get doors opened quickly. Within 5 minutes, Marcus came out looking worried, asking what was wrong, if I was okay. I told him we needed to talk in my car. Privately. Immediately. When I showed him the first photo, Sophia with another man, holding a baby, I watched my son's face go through every emotion a human being can experience in 30 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, horror, grief. He reached for the document, pulled it closer, studied it like if he just looked hard enough, it would turn into something else, something that made sense. He kept asking if I was sure it was Sophia, if maybe this was some cousin who looked like her, some explanation that would make this okay. But then I showed him the birth certificate, the bank statements, the forged checks with my signature, the custody petition with his name on it. I watched my son break. Right there in my passenger seat, this man I'd raised to be strong and capable just crumbled. Tears he couldn't control. A kind of gasping breath that comes when you can't get enough air. He kept saying he didn't understand, how he didn't see it, how he'd been sleeping next to her every night thinking they were building a life together. But we didn't have time for grief. Not yet. I told him we needed to move fast, move smart, and move carefully. We needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. We needed someone who understood both fraud and family law. I drove us straight to Robert Silverman's office. Robert had handled Gerald's estate when he passed, and I knew he had connections throughout Portland's legal community. When we walked in without an appointment, his secretary tried to tell us he was booked solid, but Robert himself came out when he heard my voice. He took one look at our faces and cleared his schedule. In his conference room, we laid it all out. Every photo from my phone, every detail from the documents. Robert's expression got darker with each revelation. He told us this wasn't just a case of infidelity or even simple theft. This was systematic fraud, identity theft, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, because in Oregon, stealing from someone over 50 using a position of trust qualified for enhanced charges. Robert made some calls right there in front of us. Within an hour, he'd contacted a private investigator named James Wong who specialized in financial crimes and infidelity cases. James could be at Robert's office first thing the next morning to start building a comprehensive case, but Robert warned us about something crucial. We couldn't confront Sophia yet. We couldn't let her know we suspected anything. The moment she realized we knew, she'd start moving money, destroying evidence, building her defense. We needed to act normal. Completely normal. For as long as it took to document everything and build an airtight case. Marcus looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. He asked how he was supposed to go home and sleep next to her. How he was supposed to pretend everything was fine when she'd been living a complete double life. I didn't have a good answer for that. I just knew we had to. That night was the longest of my life. I went home to my empty house and triple-checked every lock. I logged into my bank accounts and saw the damage in real numbers. $37,000 missing from my savings. $12,000 in fraudulent credit card charges. I'd never noticed because the statements went to an address I didn't recognize. Checks forged and cashed over 6 months. Nearly $50,000 gone. Stolen by someone I'd trusted completely. But the money wasn't even the worst part. I kept thinking about all those Sunday phone calls, all those birthday cards, all those times Sophia had hugged me and called me mom. Had any of it been real, or had I just been a target from the very beginning? A widow with inheritance money and no one to watch my back? I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, and my phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, 3 words. She's still awake. Then another text. She's on her phone, smiling, and that's when it hit me, while my son was lying there in agony. While I was sitting alone wondering how I'd been so blind, Sophia was probably texting David, probably making plans for her real life, the life she was building with my money. The next morning, James Wong arrived at Robert's office at 8 sharp. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd already started preliminary research overnight. He'd found David Chun's business registrations, 3 restaurants in the greater Portland area, all successful. He'd found the apartment Sophia had been renting under her maiden name across town. He'd even found social media accounts she'd kept private, full of photos with David and Lily, living a completely separate existence. James laid out his plan. He'd need 3 to 5 days for full surveillance. He'd document Sophia's movements, her meetings with David, her time at that secret apartment. He'd pull financial records, phone records, anything that would show the full scope of the deception. He'd find out how long this had been going on, and exactly how much money had been moved. But then James found something that made everything so much worse. He pulled up a document on his laptop and turned it toward us. It was a prenuptial agreement, one that Marcus and Sophia had never signed. But according to James's research, Sophia had consulted with 3 different attorneys in the past year about how to circumvent the lack of how to claim entitlement to Marcus's future earnings and family assets, how to maximize her settlement in a divorce. One attorney had even written her a memo outlining a strategy: establish dependency on family resources, document a lifestyle funded by those resources, and create a custody situation that would justify ongoing financial support. Lily was meant to be leveraged, a child Marcus knew nothing about, used as justification for bleeding my accounts dry. This wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just theft. This was a business plan. And we were the product being sold. The hardest thing I've ever done in my life wasn't burying my husband. It wasn't building a career in a male-dominated field back in the 90s. It wasn't even sitting in that parking lot realizing I'd been robbed by someone I loved. The hardest thing was walking into Marcus and Sophia's house 3 days later with a smile on my face and a casserole in my hands, pretending I didn't know anything. Robert and James had been clear. We needed more time. More documentation. James was tracking Sophia's movements, building a timeline, pulling records that would make the case bulletproof. But we also needed Sophia to feel safe, comfortable, unsuspecting, because people make mistakes when they think they're winning. So I called Sophia and told her I was making my famous chicken casserole and wanted to bring it over for dinner. Just a normal Thursday night with family. She sounded delighted on the phone. She told me how sweet I was, how Marcus had been stressed with work lately and this would cheer him up, how she always loved our time together. I wanted to vomit. Marcus had been briefed by Robert. He knew he had to act normal too. When I arrived at their house, the house they'd bought 2 years ago with help from my down payment gift of $30,000, Sophia greeted me at the door with a hug. She smelled like expensive perfume, the kind that costs $200 a bottle. I wondered if I'd paid for that too. We sat in their living room while the casserole heated up. Sophia asked about my week, about my book club, about whether I'd tried that new restaurant downtown she'd been telling me about. She was so good at this. So natural, every smile, perfectly timed, every laugh, completely off. If I hadn't seen those documents, I would have believed every word, but I had a job to do. Robert had coached me. Get her talking, get her comfortable. People reveal things when they think they're safe. So I mentioned that I'd been thinking about my finances lately, about maybe helping Marcus and Sophia buy a bigger house in a few years. Something with a yard for the kids they'd eventually have. I watched Sophia's eyes light up when I said that. She leaned forward, suddenly very interested in this conversation. She told me how thoughtful I was, how lucky Marcus was to have such a generous mother, how they'd actually been talking about starting a family soon, and a bigger house would be perfect for that. She even pulled up some real estate listings on her phone, showing me homes in expensive neighborhoods, properties that cost $700,000–800,000. Then she said something that made my blood freeze. She mentioned that she'd been learning more about estate planning lately, For her job, she claimed the hospital had been offering financial literacy workshops for employees. She'd realized how important it was to make sure assets were protected across generations. She asked if I'd updated my will recently, if I'd thought about trusts, if Marcus was listed as the primary beneficiary on everything. She was fishing, trying to figure out exactly how much money was in play and how to position herself to access it. I played along, told her my will was old, probably needed updating, that most of my assets would go to Marcus, of course, but I hadn't really thought through the details. I made myself sound a little confused, a little overwhelmed by financial planning, the kind of vulnerable elderly woman who might need help managing things. Sophia practically glowed. She offered to help me review my accounts sometime, to make sure everything was organized properly, to ensure Marcus would inherit smoothly without tax complications. She even mentioned a financial advisor she'd heard great things about, someone who specialized in helping retirees protect their assets. I told her that sounded wonderful. Maybe we could set up a meeting next month. The whole time we were talking, Marcus was in the kitchen pretending to check on the casserole. I could only imagine what he was feeling, listening to his wife try to manipulate his mother into giving her better access to steal even more. But then Sophia made a mistake. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it, and her whole face changed for just a second, softened, a real smile, not the practiced one she'd been giving me. She picked up the phone quickly, but not before I saw the name on the screen. David with a heart emoji. She excused herself, saying it was the hospital. She needed to take this. She walked into the hallway, and I could hear her voice drop to almost a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was completely different. Warm, intimate. The voice of someone talking to a person they actually loved. When she came back, she apologized and said there was a scheduling issue with next week's shifts. She might have to work some overnight rotations. She said it with this little sigh, like it was such an inconvenience. But I knew the truth. Those overnight rotations were her time at the other apartment, with David, with Lily, living her real life while Marcus slept alone in their bed. Over dinner, Sophia talked about a coworker's wedding she'd attended last month. She showed us photos on her phone, her in a beautiful blue dress at some fancy venue. She laughed about the terrible DJ and the drunk groomsmen who'd hit on everyone. It was such a normal story. Such a normal evening. Except James had already confirmed that Sophia hadn't attended any wedding last month. She'd been in Seattle with David for a long weekend. She'd posted photos from that trip on her private social media account, the one Marcus knew nothing about. The blue dress wasn't from a wedding. It was from a fancy restaurant where David had taken her for their anniversary. Their anniversary. They celebrated anniversaries. As I was getting ready to leave, Sophia hugged me at the door and told me how much she appreciated me, how grateful she was to be part of our family, how she knew Marcus felt the same way. She looked me right in the eyes when she said it, and that's when I realized something that James had been trying to explain to me. Sophia wasn't just lying. She believed her own performance. She'd compartmentalized so completely that she could be two different people and never let them touch. She could steal from me in the morning and hug me at night without any cognitive dissonance. That took a special kind of person, the dangerous kind. I drove home and called Robert immediately. I told him about the estate planning conversation, about Sophia's offer to help with my finances, about the financial advisor she wanted me to meet. Robert's voice got very serious. He said that financial advisor was probably part of the scheme, someone who'd help Sophia move assets or create access she didn't currently have. This wasn't just about the $50,000 she'd already taken. She was positioning herself to take everything. The next morning, James called with an update that confirmed my worst fears. He'd been following Sophia during her overnight shifts. Every single one had been fake. She'd go to the hospital in her scrubs, clock in, then leave through a side exit 20 minutes later. She'd drive to the apartment she shared with David, spend the night there with him and Lily, then return to the hospital early in the morning to clock out. She'd been doing this for over a year. Systematic, calculated, never missing a detail. But James had also discovered something else, something that would become our advantage in ways I couldn't have predicted. David Chun had no idea Sophia was married. She'd told him she was a single mother who'd had Lily from a previous relationship that ended badly. She'd told him she worked night shifts because she was building a better life for her daughter. She'd told him she was careful about introducing him to her family because her parents were traditional and didn't approve of her having a child out of wedlock. David thought he was dating a dedicated single mom. He had no idea he was the other man. He had no idea about Marcus, about the marriage, about the house they shared, which meant Sophia was running two separate cons. And when people try to juggle that many lies, eventually they drop one. We just had to wait for her to slip. James Wong became my shadow for the next 2 weeks. Not literally, of course, but he was always there, sending me updates, showing me photos, building a case so detailed it would make prosecutors weep with joy. And with every new piece of information, I understood more clearly why Sophia had chosen us, why she'd chosen me. It started before she even met Marcus. James found her employment records. Sophia had worked at 3 different hospitals in the Portland area over 7 years. At each one, she'd been flagged for being overly familiar with patients' families. Not enough to fire her, but enough to note in her file, asking too many questions about their finances, offering to help with paperwork, getting close to older patients who had adult children. At her first hospital, there had been a complaint from a family who discovered Sophia had accessed their father's medical records without authorization. She'd claimed it was an accident, a wrong button clicked in the computer system. She'd been suspended for 2 weeks but not terminated. At her second hospital, a 72-year-old widow had written Sophia into her will after Sophia spent months befriending her. The woman's son had contested it, claiming undue influence. The case was settled quietly, and Sophia left that hospital shortly after. She had a pattern, and we'd walked right into it. James had tracked how Sophia and Marcus met. It wasn't the random coffee shop encounter Marcus had always described, where they both reached for the same book on a display table and started talking. That was a story Sophia had told. The truth was darker. She'd seen Marcus at a young professionals networking event. She'd overheard him talking about his mother, about his father who'd recently passed away, about the life insurance settlement that would keep his mom comfortable. Within a week, she'd engineered a way to be at his gym at the same time he was there. Then the coffee shop, then the first date that Marcus thought he'd initiated. My son had never stood a chance. He'd been grieving his father, worried about his mother being alone, vulnerable in ways he didn't even recognize, and Sophia had seen all of that and decided he was worth the investment. But here's what James discovered that changed everything. Sophia's real motivation went deeper than just money. Her real name wasn't even Sophia Martinez like she'd told us. It was Sophia. She'd immigrated from Ukraine as a teenager with her mother, who'd died when Sophia was 20. She'd put herself through nursing school, working 3 jobs. She'd clawed her way up from poverty with nothing but determination and a complete lack of moral boundaries. James found interviews she'd done for a Ukrainian American community newsletter years ago, before she'd learned to keep her past quiet. She'd talked about growing up watching American movies, seeing the big houses and the comfortable lives, promising herself she'd have that one day no matter what it took. She'd talked about how Americans were soft, trusting, easy to read. She'd basically written a manifesto for financial predation. And no one had paid attention. David Chun hadn't been her first affair, either. James found evidence of at least 2 other relationships she'd maintained while married to Marcus, both with successful men. Both ended quietly when she'd extracted what she needed, a car one time, funded IVF treatments another time that she'd told Marcus she couldn't afford. Lily wasn't even David's first child with Sophia. There'd been a pregnancy 3 years ago that ended in a termination. David knew about it. Marcus never did. Every revelation made me feel sicker. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a career. Sophia had turned manipulation into an art form, and we were just her latest exhibition. But knowledge is power, and now I had something Sophia didn't know I had. Complete visibility into her entire operation. Robert scheduled a meeting with me, Marcus and James at his office on a Friday afternoon. He'd been consulting with a criminal attorney and a prosecutor friend of his. The case we were building could result in serious prison time. Identity theft alone carried up to 5 years in Oregon. Add in the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, the forged documents, the systematic fraud. We were looking at potentially a decade or more. But Robert warned us about something crucial. Criminal cases took time. Months. Maybe years. And in that time, Sophia could disappear, move assets offshore, flee to a country without extradition. We needed to trap her. Catch her in the act of doing something so flagrant, so undeniable, that she couldn't run or hide or explain it away. That's when Marcus spoke up with an idea that honestly shocked me. My gentle, trusting son had learned to think like his enemy. He suggested we give Sophia an opportunity she couldn't resist. We'd stage a situation where I appeared to be making a major financial decision, something that would give her access to a large sum of money. We'd let her think she was about to score her biggest con yet, and we'd catch her in the act with cameras, witnesses, and documentation. Robert loved it. James loved it even more. He started planning immediately. The setup would be simple but effective. I would tell Sophia I'd decided to sell some property. Gerald had left me a piece of land in eastern Oregon that was supposedly worth $300,000. I'd tell her I was overwhelmed by the process and needed help. I'd ask her to come with me to meet with a real estate attorney to handle the paperwork. Except the attorney would be someone Robert knew. The office would be equipped with hidden cameras, and every word Sophia said, every document she touched, every action she took would be recorded. If she tried to manipulate the sale to funnel money to herself, we'd have her on camera committing fraud. If she tried to add herself to the transaction in any way, we'd have proof of attempted theft. If she just advised me honestly, then at least we'd know where her boundaries were. But we all knew she wouldn't advise me honestly. That wasn't who she was. James had one more piece of information that sealed our strategy. He'd been monitoring Sophia's private emails and text messages legally through methods I didn't ask too many questions about. She'd been communicating with that financial advisor she'd mentioned to me. They were planning for her to introduce us within the next 3 weeks. The financial advisor was a man named Terrence Boyd, and he had a record. Nothing major, nothing that would show up on a basic background check, but James had dug deeper. Boyd had been investigated twice for elder financial abuse, never charged. But the pattern was there. He'd help clients restructure their assets in ways that benefited him and whoever referred them to him. Sophia was planning to feed me to Boyd like a lamb to slaughter. They'd probably worked together before on other vulnerable widows. But now, we'd flipped the script. Instead of waiting for her to bring me to Boyd, I'd come to her with an even bigger opportunity, the land sale. $300,000 that could be moved, managed, protected. She'd see dollar signs and forget to be careful. Robert spent the next week setting up the trap. He found an attorney named Margaret Chun, who specialized in real estate law and was happy to help expose a predator. Margaret's office was outfitted with 3 hidden cameras and recording equipment, sophisticated enough to capture whispers. James briefed me on exactly what to say and how to act. I needed to seem overwhelmed, a little confused, very trusting. I needed to give Sophia opportunities to insert herself into the process. I needed to let her think she was helping when really she was digging her own grave. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks away. That gave Sophia time to plan, to position herself, to set up whatever scheme she thought would work. It also gave me time to practice being someone I'd never been before. Bait. Marcus asked me one night if I was scared, if I worried about what would happen when Sophia realized we'd been playing her. Robert had warned us that cornered animals were dangerous, and Sophia was nothing if not survived. I wasn't scared of Sophia anymore. I was scared of what would have happened if I hadn't opened that lunchbox. How much more she would have taken, how completely she would have destroyed us. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those Sunday phone calls, all those times she'd called me Mom. I kept wondering if there'd ever been a single genuine moment between us, or if every word, every gesture, every smile had been calculated. I decided it didn't matter anymore. Whatever she'd been, whatever I believed she was, that person never existed. The real Sophia was the one James had documented. the one who'd made fraud into a lifestyle, and in less than 24 hours, we'd finally see her without the mask. The morning of the meeting, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart racing. Not from fear, exactly, but from adrenaline. This was it. After weeks of pretending, of smiling through dinners, of hugging someone who'd been robbing me blind, we were finally taking action. Robert had called me the night before with unexpected news. The prosecutor he'd been consulting with, a woman named Diana Reeves, wanted to meet me before the trap was set. She wanted to look me in the eye, hear my story directly, and make sure I understood what we were about to do. I met Diana at a small coffee shop downtown at 6:30 that morning. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense handshake. She ordered black coffee and got straight to the point. She told me she'd been prosecuting financial crimes for 12 years. She'd seen every variation of elder abuse, every scheme, every manipulation tactic. But what Sophia had done was different. More sophisticated, more cold. Most financial abusers were opportunists who took advantage of confusion or cognitive decline. Sophia had actively cultivated trust over years, had integrated herself into our family, had made herself indispensable before she ever took a dollar. Diana said that kind of predator was rare and dangerous, because they didn't just steal money. They studied their victims, learned their vulnerabilities, and exploited them with surgical precision. But Diana also told me something that changed how I saw this entire situation. She'd done her own research into Sophia's background, going deeper than even James had managed, and she'd found something that would become our nuclear option. Sophia wasn't just running a con on us, she was running from something. Back in Chicago, 8 years ago, before she'd moved to Portland, Sophia had been engaged to a man named Richard Holbrook. Wealthy family, tech executive, exactly the kind of target she preferred. They'd been planning a wedding. Sophia had convinced Richard to add her to several of his accounts for household expenses. Then Richard's father had a stroke, became incapacitated, needed full-time care, and suddenly Richard wasn't the carefree bachelor anymore. He was stressed, stretched thin, dealing with medical decisions and estate issues. Sophia had disappeared. Literally, vanished one weekend with $47,000 from Richard's accounts, plus jewelry, plus a car. Richard reported it to police, but by the time they investigated, Sophia had moved to Portland, changed her last name from Kovalenko to Martinez, and started fresh. Richard had been too embarrassed to pursue it further, too humiliated that he'd been conned. He'd written it off as an expensive lesson and moved on with his life. But Diana had found Richard, and Richard was willing to testify. This changed everything. We weren't just building a case about theft for me. We were establishing a pattern of behavior, a history, proof that Sophia had done this before and would do it again. Diana explained that pattern evidence was crucial in these cases. Defense attorneys always tried to paint these situations as misunderstandings, as relationship disputes, as gray areas. But when you could show someone had done the exact same thing to multiple victims, the gray disappeared. It became black and white. Richard's testimony would make our case bulletproof. But Diana needed something from me. She needed me to be willing to follow through no matter what. To testify in open court, to face Sophia's defense attorney, to have my financial records exposed, to relive every moment of betrayal in front of strangers. She'd seen cases fall apart because victims got cold feet, got embarrassed, got manipulated by the abuser one more time. She needed to know I wouldn't back down. I looked Diana straight in the eye and told her about the moment I opened that lunchbox, about seeing my son's face when he realized his entire marriage was a lie, about the nights I'd lain awake wondering what else Sophia had planned for us. I told Diana I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. She smiled for the first time that morning, told me I was exactly the kind of witness prosecutors dreamed about. Clear, credible, angry enough to be motivated but controlled enough to be effective. Then she gave me her cell phone number and told me to call her the moment anything felt wrong. If Sophia became suspicious, if the meeting went sideways, if I felt unsafe at any point, Diana would have officers ready to move if needed. That conversation with Diana did something for me. It made this real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't just about revenge or getting my money back. This was about stopping someone who would keep doing this, who would find another widow, another grieving son, another family to destroy. By the time I got home, it was 8 a.m. The meeting with Margaret Chun was scheduled for 2 p.m. I had 6 hours to prepare. I called Sophia mid-morning. Keeping my voice light and slightly anxious, I told her I'd been thinking more about that estate planning conversation we'd had, about the property Gerald had left me in eastern Oregon. I'd received a call from someone interested in buying it, and I was overwhelmed by all the legal paperwork. Would she be able to come with me to meet with a real estate attorney this afternoon, just for moral support and to help me understand what I was signing? There was a pause on the line. Just a beat. I could almost hear the calculations happening in her head. Then she told me of course she'd come. She'd be happy to help. She had the afternoon off anyway, and this is what family does for each other. We help each other through complicated situations. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. She asked which attorney I was meeting with. I gave her Margaret Chun's name and address. Told her I'd found Margaret through a friend from church, someone who'd said she was patient with older clients who needed extra time to understand things. Sophia said that sounded perfect. She'd meet me there at 2. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and let myself shake. Just for a minute, let myself feel the rage and grief and betrayal that I'd been holding back for weeks. Then I pulled myself together. I had a performance to give. James called around noon with a final briefing. He'd be in a van outside Margaret's office, monitoring the video feeds in real time. Robert would be in the conference room next door, listening through the wall. Diana had 2 detectives on standby 3 blocks away. If Sophia took the bait, if she tried to insert herself into the transaction in any illegal way, we'd have everything we needed. James reminded me not to be too obvious. Let her think she was being clever. Let her believe she was the smartest person in the room. That wouldn't be hard. Sophia always believed that. I arrived at Margaret's office at 1. The building was a small professional complex, nicely decorated, completely ordinary. Margaret greeted me warmly, playing her part perfectly. She offered me tea and made small talk about the weather while we waited for Sophia. At exactly 2 p.m., Sophia walked in. She was dressed professionally, but not too formally, slacks and a nice blouse. Hair pulled back. Minimal jewelry. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a caring daughter-in-law helping her mother-in-law with confusing paperwork. She, me, told Margaret how glad she was that I had someone patient to work with, how these legal matters could be so overwhelming for people of my generation. People of my generation, like I was some addled old woman who couldn't read a contract. Margaret smiled and said she understood completely. She'd worked with many clients who appreciated having family members present for important decisions. Then we sat down, and the trap was set. Margaret pulled out a thick folder of documents. She explained that the property sale was relatively straightforward. The buyer was offering $280,000, which was below my asking price, but still very fair for the current market. The closing costs would be about $15,000, leaving me with approximately $265,000 net. I played my part, asked questions that seemed confused, worried about tax implications, wondered aloud how I'd manage such a large sum of money, whether I should just leave it in checking, whether banks were even safe anymore. Sophia jumped in exactly as we'd predicted. She told Margaret she'd been helping me organize my finances lately, that she'd been learning about estate planning and asset protection, that she wanted to make sure I was taken care of properly. Margaret nodded, encouraging her to continue, and then Sophia made her move. She suggested that instead of just putting the money in my checking account where it might be vulnerable, we should consider setting up a trust, something that would protect the assets and make sure they were managed properly. She even had the name of a financial advisor who specialized in exactly this kind of thing, Terrence Boyd. She could call him right now, get him on the phone, maybe even have him come to this meeting to discuss options. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face confused and grateful. I told Sophia that sounded complicated. Would she help me understand what a trust meant? And that's when Sophia explained exactly how she'd planned to steal from me. She described a trust structure where I'd be the grantor, but there'd be co-trustees to help manage things. People with financial expertise who could make sure the money was invested wisely, protected from market volatility, available when I needed it but secure otherwise. Margaret asked who these co-trustees would be. Sophia said it would make sense for the trustees to be people who already understood my financial situation. People I trusted, maybe her and Marcus together, since they were my closest family. That way, I wouldn't have to worry about strangers making decisions about my money. There it was, recorded on 3 different cameras, Sophia suggesting she should have direct control over $250,000 of my money. Margaret asked a few more questions, all designed to get Sophia to elaborate, and Sophia, thinking she was being helpful, explained in detail how the trust would work, how funds could be moved, how trustees could make investment decisions, how I could receive regular distributions for my living expenses while the principal remained protected. Protected? She actually used that word. What she was describing was a mechanism that would give her legal access to my money, the ability to move it, invest it, and skim from it in ways I'd never notice until it was too late. Margaret told us this all sounded very complex. She'd need to consult with a trust attorney. She suggested we schedule another meeting for next week, maybe with Mr. Boyd present so he could explain the financial management aspects. Sophia loved that idea. She immediately pulled out her phone and said she'd text Terrence right now to check his availability. We scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following Tuesday. Margaret said she'd have trust documents drafted for me to review. Sophia thanked her for being so thorough and told me how lucky I was to have such a competent attorney. As we walked out of the office together, Sophia was practically glowing. She told me she was so glad I was taking these steps to protect myself, that Gerald would be proud of how responsibly I was handling his legacy, that she'd make sure everything was set up perfectly. I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot and told her I didn't know what I'd do without her. She squeezed my hand and said, "That's what family is for." I watched her drive away, and then I walked back into Margaret's building where Robert was waiting in the conference room with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. He told me we had her. Everything she'd said was caught on camera. Every suggestion, every recommendation, every detail of how she'd planned to gain control of my money. But it got better. While Sophia was explaining the trust structure to Margaret, James had been tracking the text she'd sent to Terrence Boyd, and Boyd had responded immediately, excited about the new client. He'd even mentioned his usual fee structure, 20% of assets under management plus commissions on any investments he recommended. 20% of $265,000, over $50,000 just in fees, not counting whatever else they'd planned to skim. Diana called me an hour later. She'd watched the footage. She told me it was textbook fraud conspiracy. Sophia had just handed us everything we needed to prosecute, not just for the theft that had already occurred, but for attempted theft and conspiracies to commit financial exploitation. But Diana had one more piece of news. Richard Holbrook, the man Sophia had conned in Chicago, had agreed to fly to Portland next week. He wanted to meet me. He said he'd spent 8 years wishing he'd pressed charges, wishing he'd stopped her before she could do this to someone else. He wanted to look Sophia in the eye when we took her down. We had our case. We had our evidence. We had corroborating witnesses. All we needed now was the perfect moment to spring the trap. The days between that meeting and the scheduled follow-up felt like watching a house of cards in slow motion, knowing exactly when and how it was going to collapse. Sophia called me 3 times over the next few days. Each conversation was a masterclass in manipulation that I could now see clearly. She asked how I was feeling about the trust arrangement, whether I had any concerns she could address. She reminded me that this was all about protecting me, about making sure I was taken care of. She even invited me to lunch to discuss it further. We sat at a cafe downtown, and she showed me printouts she'd made about different types of trusts, about asset protection strategies, about how wealthy families manage their money across generations. She'd done her homework. She'd made it look like she was genuinely trying to educate me. But I noticed something during that lunch. Something that would become crucial. Sophia's phone buzzed constantly. She kept glancing at it, and twice she excused herself to take calls. When she came back from the second call, she looked stressed in a way I'd never seen before. Her smile was tighter, her jaw was clenched. I asked if everything was okay. She waved it off, said it was just work drama, a scheduling conflict with another nurse that was getting messy. But I knew it wasn't work, so I texted James from under the table, asked him to dig into whatever was happening in Sophia's other life. He called me 2 hours later with information that changed our entire strategy. David Chun had figured something out, not everything, but enough to be suspicious. He'd apparently asked Sophia why she never stayed at her apartment during the day, why he could never reach her at the hospital she claimed to work at, why her schedule seemed to change constantly without explanation. Sophia had been scrambling to contain the situation. She'd told David she was being stalked by an ex, that she had to be careful about her movements, that she couldn't give him her work number for safety reasons. David was starting to question whether any of it made sense. The foundation of Sophia's double life was cracking. And when people are desperate, when their carefully constructed worlds are falling apart, they make mistakes. James suggested we accelerate our timeline. Strike while Sophia was distracted, vulnerable, off balance. Gianna agreed. Robert was initially hesitant, but came around when James showed him text messages between Sophia and Terrence Boyd that had become increasingly aggressive. Boyd was pressuring Sophia to close the deal with me quickly. He had other opportunities waiting. He needed to know if this was happening or if he should move on. There was tension in those messages, a sense that this partnership between them wasn't as solid as it seemed. That's when I realized what the perfect trap would be. We'd confront Sophia not in some neutral location, not in a lawyer's office or a police station. We'd do it at the place where she felt most powerful, most in control. We'd do it at her and Marcus's house, in the home she'd built with my son, using money I'd helped provide. And we wouldn't just expose her to law enforcement. We'd expose her to everyone. Marcus, David, Chun. Her entire carefully balanced world brought together in one moment of devastating truth. Robert thought I was crazy. He said it was too risky, too theatrical, that we should just have her arrested quietly and let the legal system handle it. But Diana understood. She said these kinds of predators lived in compartments. They kept their lies separate, their victims isolated, their schemes contained. The way to truly break them was to force all those compartments to collide at once. So we built a plan that was probably more elaborate than it needed to be, but felt absolutely necessary. First, James would contact David Chun, not as an investigator, but as someone with information David needed to hear about the woman he thought he knew. James would tell him that Sophia was married, that she had another life, that if David wanted answers, he should be at a specific address at a specific time on Saturday afternoon. Second, we'd have Richard Holbrook there, the man from Chicago who'd been conned 8 years ago, physical proof that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-time mistake, but a pattern. Third, Diana would have 2 detectives present, not in uniform, not obviously law enforcement, but ready to make an arrest the moment we had Sophia's reaction on record. And finally, Marcus and I would confront her together with all the evidence we'd gathered. Every document, every bank statement, every photograph, every recording from Margaret Chun's office. The confrontation was scheduled for Saturday at 3 p.m. We chose that time because Sophia had told Marcus she was working a day shift at the hospital. It would force her to admit she'd lied about where she was, which would set the tone for everything else. Marcus was barely holding himself together. In the days leading up to Saturday, I watched my son go through every stage of grief. Denial that this was really happening, anger at Sophia and at himself for not seeing it, bargaining about whether there was any way this could be a misunderstanding, depression that seemed to pin him to his couch, unable to move or eat or sleep properly. I asked him more than once if he was sure he wanted to be there for the confrontation, if maybe it would be easier to let Robert and Diana handle it. He told me he needed to see her face when the truth came out. He needed to hear her try to explain it. He needed that moment of clarity, no matter how painful, so he could start to heal. I understood that. I needed it too. Friday night, I couldn't sleep. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd say it, what I'd do if Sophia tried to lie her way out. Part of me worried she'd find a way to spin this, to make herself the victim, to convince Marcus that we were the ones in the wrong. But then I thought about that lunchbox, about those documents she'd been so carefully hiding, about the life she'd built on lies and theft. And I knew that no amount of charm or tears or manipulation would be enough to overcome the evidence. Around 2 a.m., My phone buzzed. A text from James. He'd just confirmed that David Chun would be there tomorrow. David was angry, confused, hurt, but he wanted answers, and he was willing to confront Sophia to get them. James also sent me something else, a final piece of information he'd uncovered that was almost too perfect. The apartment Sophia had been renting with David, she'd used my stolen money for the security deposit and the first 3 months of rent. She'd literally used my cash to build her secret life. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Saturday morning arrived. Marcus came to my house at 10 a.m., and we spent the next few hours going over the plan. Robert arrived at noon to finalize details. Diana called at 1 to confirm her detectives were in position. Richard Holbrook had flown in the night before. He met us at my house at 1:30, and I have to admit, seeing him was surreal. He looked like he'd been carved from the same pain Marcus and I were feeling. Older now, more guarded, but still carrying that wound of betrayal. He told us his story in more detail than Diana had shared. How Sophia had seemed perfect at first. How she'd loved his father, visited him in the hospital, seemed genuinely concerned about the family. How she'd cried when his father died and held Richard through his grief. And then how she'd vanished with his money and his trust the moment things got complicated. He said he'd spent years wondering if he could have stopped her. If there were signs he'd missed, if he could have saved someone else from going through what he went through. Now he had that chance. At 2:30, we all drove to Marcus and Sophia's house. Diana's detectives were already parked down the street. James was in his surveillance van around the corner. David Chun was scheduled to arrive at 3:15 after we'd already started the confrontation. Marcus unlocked the door to his own house with shaking hands. We walked into the living room. Marcus, Robert, Richard, and Diana. We set up our evidence on the coffee table. Documents stacked neatly. My laptop ready with the video files from Margaret Chun's office. Everything organized like a prosecution case, because that's exactly what it was. At 3 p.m., Sophia's car pulled into the driveway. She wasn't supposed to be home. She was supposed to be at the hospital, working her shift. But James had sent her a text from a spoofed number claiming to be from hospital administration, saying there was an urgent scheduling issue and she needed to come home immediately to access her personal calendar. She'd taken the bait. We heard her key in the lock, heard her footsteps in the hallway, heard her voice calling out for Marcus, asking if everything was okay. And then she walked into the living room and saw all of us sitting there, saw the evidence spread across the table, saw Richard Holbrook, a ghost from her past made flesh. The color drained from her face so completely I thought she might faint. Marcus stood up slowly. His voice was calm when he spoke, calmer than I expected, but I could hear the tremor underneath. He told her to sit down. We needed to talk. And this time, finally, we were going to hear the truth. Sophia's eyes darted around the room, calculating, looking for an exit, looking for an angle. I could see her brain working overtime, trying to figure out which lie would work, which version of herself she needed to be. But then her eyes landed on the birth certificate sitting on top of the document pile. Lily Chun's birth certificate, and she knew there was no lie big enough to cover this. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence in that living room was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear Sophia's breathing getting faster, could hear the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds of her life as she knew it. She tried to smile, that same warm smile she'd given me 1,000 times. She asked what this was about, why everyone looked so serious, whether something had happened. Marcus didn't let her finish. He picked up the birth certificate and held it in front of her face. He asked her to read it out loud, every word. Sophia's hands were shaking when she took the document. Her voice cracked when she read her own name listed as mother to a child Marcus had never heard of. She tried to stop halfway through, tried to hand it back, but Marcus told her to keep reading. When she finished, she immediately started trying to explain. She said it was complicated, that she'd been young, that it was from before she met Marcus, that she'd given the baby up and hadn't thought it was relevant to their marriage. I was the one who spoke next. I told her to stop lying. We knew Lily was 2 years old. We knew Sophia had been with David Chun throughout her marriage. We knew about the apartment across town, the secret life, the fake hospital shifts. Sophia's face changed then. The mask slipped. I saw something cold flash across her features before she caught herself and tried to look confused. Hurt, misunderstood. Robert stood and began laying out documents one by one. Bank statements showing the transfers from my account, forged checks with my signature, credit card statements for accounts I never opened. Each piece of paper was another nail in her coffin. Sophia kept shaking her head, saying there must be some mistake, that she didn't understand where all this was coming from. She turned to Marcus, reached for his hand, told him in this pleading voice that someone was trying to frame her, that this was all wrong. Marcus pulled his hand away like he'd been burned. That's when Diana stepped forward and introduced herself. Detective Diana Reeves, Financial Crimes Division. Sophia's entire body went rigid. Diana explained in a calm, professional voice that we'd been building a case against her for weeks, that every transaction had been traced, that we had video evidence of her attempting to defraud me out of an additional $250,000. Diana nodded to me, and I opened my laptop, turned it around so Sophia could see the screen, and I played the recording from Margaret Chun's office. Watching Sophia watch herself on that video was something I'll never forget. She saw herself explaining how I should set up a trust with her as a co-trustee. Heard herself suggesting ways to move my money, protect my assets, ensure everything was managed properly. Every word she'd said, recorded in crystal clear audio and video. When the recording ended, Sophia was crying, real tears. Not the manipulative kind. These were tears of panic, of a plan falling apart, of consequences closing in. She tried one more angle. She told Marcus she'd made mistakes, that she'd gotten in over her head, that she'd been scared and made bad decisions, but she loved him. She really did, and they could fix this together. That's when Richard Holbrook spoke for the first time. He stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly and walked over to stand in front of Sophia. He told her he'd heard a very similar speech 8 years ago in Chicago, right before she disappeared with his money and his ability to trust anyone ever again. Sophia's face went white. She recognized him. I could see the moment it clicked. The moment she realized her past had literally walked into her present. Richard told Marcus and me his story. Every detail Sophia had stolen from him. Every lie she'd told. Every promise she'd broken. He said he'd been too ashamed to press charges back then, too embarrassed that he'd been fooled. But he wasn't that person anymore. He looked directly at Sophia and told her he was here to make sure she never did this to anyone else again. Sophia tried to stand up, tried to move toward the door, but Diana's detectives stepped into the doorway. They weren't in uniform, but their presence was unmistakable. Professional. Ready? That's when the doorbell rang. Marcus looked confused, looked at me. I nodded. He walked to the door and opened it. David Chun stood on the porch, holding Lily in his arms. The little girl was beautiful. Dark hair, big eyes, completely innocent of the disaster unfolding around her. David's face was a mixture of anger and confusion. He asked if this was Marcus. If this was Sophia's husband. Marcus couldn't speak, he just nodded. David walked into the living room and saw Sophia sitting there, surrounded by people she'd betrayed. He looked at her with an expression I'd never want directed at me. Betrayal mixed with disgust, mixed with heartbreak. He told the room that James Wong had contacted him yesterday, had told him that Sophia was married, that she had another life, that everything she'd told him had been a lie. At first, David hadn't believed it. He'd thought it was some kind of scam, some jealous ex-boyfriend trying to cause trouble, but then he'd looked into it, made some calls, checked some records, found the marriage license, found this address, found the truth. He asked Sophia how long she'd planned to keep this going, how long she thought she could juggle two completely separate lives, whether she'd ever planned to tell him the truth or if she was just going to disappear one day with whatever she'd managed to steal from everyone around her. Sophia couldn't even look at him. She was staring at the floor, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. David turned to Marcus and apologized. Said he'd had no idea she was married, that if he'd known, he never would have. He couldn't even finish the sentence. He looked at his daughter sleeping against his shoulder and asked Marcus if he'd known about Lily. Marcus shook his head. His voice broke when he said he'd thought they were trying to start a family soon, that he'd been excited about the idea of having kids with Sophia. The two men just looked at each other for a moment, two victims of the same predator, two people who'd trusted someone who'd made trust into a weapon. David said he was filing for full custody of Lily, that there was no way he was letting Sophia have unsupervised access to his daughter after this. He'd already contacted his lawyer. He wanted to make sure Lily never learned how to lie and manipulate the way her mother had. That seemed to snap something in Sophia. She started screaming, not crying, screaming. She said we were all ganging up on her, that we didn't understand, that she'd been trying to survive, trying to build a better life, trying to protect herself. Deanna's voice cut through the noise like a knife. She told Sophia to stop talking, that everything she said could and would be used against her, that she had the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. It was the Miranda warning. Official, final. Sophia looked around the room one more time, at Marcus, who wouldn't meet her eyes, at me, who stared back at her without flinching, at Richard, who represented her past catching up to her, at David, who represented her present falling apart, at Diana, who represented her future in handcuffs. She asked in this small, broken voice if she could please call a lawyer. Diana nodded, told her she could make that call from the police station. Then she gestured to her detectives, who stepped forward with handcuffs. The moment those cuffs clicked around Sophia's wrists, something in the room changed. The tension that had been building for weeks, maybe months, maybe years, finally released. It was over. The game was done. The mask was off. As the detectives led Sophia toward the door, she turned back one last time. She looked at Marcus with tears still streaming down her face and told him she was sorry, that she'd never meant for any of this to happen, that she'd loved him in her own way. Marcus stood there for a long moment. Then he said the most devastating thing I've ever heard him say. He told her he didn't believe her. He didn't think she was capable of love. He thought she was capable of performance, of calculation, of manipulation, but not love. People who love each other don't destroy each other the way she'd tried to destroy us. Sophia didn't respond, just let the detectives guide her out the door, down the steps, into the waiting unmarked car. We all stood in that living room for a long time after she left. Nobody quite knew what to say. The evidence was still spread across the coffee table. The video was still paused on my laptop screen. The truth was finally fully exposed, laid bare for everyone to see. David was the first to leave. He thanked us quietly for letting him know the truth. He told Marcus again that he was sorry, that Lily would never know any of this until she was old enough to understand, that he'd make sure she had a better example of how to treat people. Richard left next. He hugged me and Marcus and told us we were brave, that pressing charges was the hardest part. But we'd done it. We'd stopped her. That was more than he'd been able to do 8 years ago. Then it was just me and Marcus and Robert and Diana. Surrounded by the wreckage of the life Marcus had thought he was building, Diana collected all the evidence, told us she'd be in touch about next steps, about the prosecution timeline, about what we'd need to do to prepare for trial. Robert added some notes about civil proceedings, about recovering the stolen funds, about protecting our assets going forward. And then they left too. Marcus and I sat on his couch in his living room in his house that suddenly didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like a crime scene, like a place where something terrible had happened. He asked me if I thought any of it had been real, any moment, any smile, any time she'd said she loved him. I told him the truth. I didn't know. Maybe in her own twisted way, she'd felt something. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that we'd survived, that we'd fought back, that we'd refused to be victims, and that tomorrow we'd start figuring out how to heal. The trial took 7 months to reach a courtroom. 7 months of depositions, legal filings, motions, and 7 months of reliving every detail, every betrayal, every moment of discovering the truth. Sophie's defense attorney tried everything. Claimed the transfers were authorized gifts, claimed the forged signatures were mistakes. Claimed Sophia had been in an abusive relationship and was afraid for her safety. Claimed she'd been manipulated by Terrence Boyd, who'd convinced her to do things she didn't understand were illegal. None of it held up. The evidence was too clear. The pattern too obvious. Richard Holbrook's testimony to damn it. The prosecution presented our case methodically. Every bank statement, Every forged check. Every email between Sophia and Boyd discussing how to extract more money from me. The video from Margaret Chun's office where Sophia laid out exactly how she planned to gain control of my assets. Diana Reeves was brilliant. She didn't need to be dramatic or theatrical. She just presented fact after fact after fact until there was no room left for doubt. I testified for 3 hours, walked the jury through that morning when Sophia handed me the lunchbox, described finding the documents, explained my background as a tax accountant, how I knew fraud when I saw it, told them about the years of trust I'd given Sophia, the Sunday phone calls, the birthday cards, the feeling of having a daughter again after losing my husband. Sophia's attorney tried to make me seem vindictive, asked if I'd been jealous of my son's wife, if I'd been looking for a reason to break them up, if I'd manipulated the evidence to paint Sophia in a bad light. I looked that attorney right in the eye and told her the only person who'd manipulated anything was her client. I hadn't needed to paint Sophia in a bad light. Sophia had done that perfectly well herself. Marcus testified too. That was harder to watch. He had to sit on that stand and admit to a room full of strangers how completely he'd been fooled, how he'd loved someone who'd never really existed, how he'd shared a bed with someone who was planning to destroy his family. The defense tried to claim Marcus had been neglectful, that Sophia had turned to David because Marcus wasn't emotionally available. Marcus simply responded that neglect wasn't an excuse for fraud, for theft, for building an entire secret life funded with stolen money. David Chun testified about how Sophia had lied to him, how she'd created a fictional version of herself as a struggling single mother, how he'd believed he was helping her build stability when really he was just another mark, another source of whatever she could extract from people who trusted her. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict on each count. Guilty, 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 identity, theft, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, conspiracy to commit fraud, 8 separate counts, 8 guilty verdicts. Sophia's face stayed completely blank when the verdicts were read. No tears this time, no emotion at all, just a cold, empty stare straight ahead. The judge sentenced her 6 weeks later, 2 years in prison, full restitution of every dollar she'd stolen, plus interest and penalties. A permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting me or Marcus, permanent loss of her nursing license, a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. 2 years seemed short to me. For everything she'd done, everything she'd destroyed, 2 years felt like nothing. But Deanna explained that, with her record and the restitution requirements, Sophia's life as she knew it was over. She'd be a convicted felon. She'd never work in healthcare again. She'd be monitored, restricted, permanently marked as someone who couldn't be trusted. And the civil suit Robert filed on our behalf meant she'd be paying us back for decades. Every dollar she earned for the rest of her life would be garnished until the full amount was repaid. It wasn't the revenge fantasy I'd sometimes imagined during those long, angry nights, but it was justice, real, tangible, permanent justice. Marcus sold the house 3 months after the trial ended. He said he couldn't sleep there anymore, couldn't walk through rooms where Sophia had pretended to be someone she wasn't, couldn't live with the ghost of a marriage that had never been real. He moved into a smaller place downtown, started therapy twice a week, joined a support group for people who'd been victims of financial fraud, slowly, painfully, started to rebuild his sense of trust and his sense of self. I helped him move. We spent a weekend packing up his life, sorting through belongings, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. We found photos from his wedding day. Sophia in that white dress, smiling like the happiest woman in the world. Marcus stared at those photos for a long time before putting them in a box marked for storage. Not thrown away, but not displayed either. Evidence of something that had happened, even if it hadn't been what he thought. One afternoon while we were packing, Marcus found a journal Sophia had kept hidden in the back of her closet. He asked if I wanted to read it with him. Part of me didn't. Part of me wanted to leave it closed, leave her thoughts and feelings unknown. But we read it together. The entries were chilling. Sophia had documented her strategies like someone planning a business merger. Notes about my financial situation. Observations about Marcus's emotional vulnerabilities after Gerald's death. calculations about how much she could take before anyone would notice, plans for the trust scheme months before she'd ever mentioned it to me. There were also entries about David, about Lily, and those entries were different, more emotional, more real. She wrote about how being with them felt like the life she deserved, how Marcus was just a means to an end, how she'd done what she had to do to survive, to build something better. That last part told me everything I needed to know about Sophia. She genuinely believed she was the victim in all of this, that society had forced her to lie and steal because that was the only way someone like her could get ahead. She'd built an entire worldview where her fraud was justified, where the people she hurt were just obstacles to overcome. Marcus closed the journal and said he was grateful he'd found it, not because it made him feel better, but because it removed any lingering doubt, any question about whether some small part of their relationship had been authentic. The journal proved it hadn't been. From the very beginning, he'd been a target, not a partner. We burned that journal in my fireplace that night, watched the pages curl and blacken and turn to ash. It felt necessary, a ritual of letting go. Today, a year and a half after opening that lunchbox, I'm doing okay. More than okay, actually. I've reinforced every financial account I have with security measures that would make Fort Knox jealous. I've joined a community organization that educates seniors about financial fraud. I give talks at local community centers about my experience, about the warning signs I missed, about how predators like Sophia operate. It's healing in a strange way, turning my pain into protection for other people, making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else who might not have the resources or knowledge to fight back. Marcus is doing better too. He's dating again, carefully. He met someone at his support group, actually. Another person who'd been conned by someone they trusted. They understand each other's caution, each other's scars. It's tentative and slow, but it's real, built on honesty instead of performance. He told me last week that he's grateful for what happened, not glad it happened, but grateful, because it taught him something important about resilience, about his own strength, about the fact that he could survive something that felt unsurvivable. I understand what he means. I'm grateful not for the betrayal, but for discovering that when everything fell apart, I had the spine to fight back, that decades of working with numbers and regulations had given me skills I didn't know would matter, that I could protect myself and my son when it mattered most. Sophia gets out of prison in 6 months. I don't think about that too much. The restraining order is permanent. She's legally forbidden from being within 500 feet of me or Marcus. Diana has assured me that any violation will result in immediate arrest and additional charges. Part of me wonders if Sophia learned anything, if she's spent these 2 years reflecting on the damage she caused, if she's capable of genuine remorse, but honestly, I don't think she is. I think she's someone who learned to survive by taking from others, and prison is just another obstacle to overcome. I think when she gets out, she'll find another city, another identity, another set of victims. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Richard Holbrook and Marcus and I were enough to break that cycle, but I'm not naive enough to believe it's certain. What I do know is this: the people we let into our homes, into our families, into our hearts, have enormous power over us. They know our routines, our passwords, our vulnerabilities. Most people honor that trust. Most people deserve it. But some people see trust as a weakness to exploit. And those people are very, very good at hiding who they really are. The day Sophia handed me that lunchbox, she made a mistake. One simple mistake in an otherwise carefully orchestrated con. She grabbed the wrong bag on her way out the door, and that mistake unraveled everything. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if she hadn't made that mistake. How much more she would have taken? How long she would have kept going? Whether Marcus and I would have figured it out eventually, or if we would have just been left confused and broke, wondering what happened to all the money. I'll never know. And I'm okay with that. What I do know is that I'm stronger than I thought I was, that my son is more resilient than either of us knew, that justice, while imperfect and slow, is still possible, that fighting back, even when it's terrifying, even when you're not sure you can win, is always worth it. My name is Patricia Donovan. I'm 53 years old now, and I survived someone who tried to destroy me. If you're watching this because something similar happened to you, because someone you trusted betrayed you, because you're wondering if you're strong enough to fight back, I want you to know something. You are. You're stronger than you think, and you don't have to face it alone. Before I go, I want to hear from you. What city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. I love knowing there are people all over the world who are listening to these stories, learning from them, maybe protecting themselves because of them. And if you want to make sure you hear more stories like this, stories about survival and justice and finding strength when you need it most, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that button. Join this community of people who refuse to be victims, because that's what we are. Not victims. Survivors. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And remember, trust is precious. Give it carefully, protect it fiercely, and if someone breaks it, don't be afraid to fight back.